Hi, my name is John Light, and I've spent over 20 years working throughout all corners of the recruiting world. Our podcast, Drowning in the Tech Talent Pool, is a resource to help you stay afloat and get ahead of your competition. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Drowning in the Tech Talent Pool. I'm your host, John Light, the president at Sabretooth Recruiting, and today I have with me Sarah Brown, the author of a book called Lead Upwards, that's all about joiners and startups and the whole VC space and everything that's important in the tech world. Plus, she just happens to be an accomplished marketing executive in her own right. Sarah, welcome so much to our podcast today.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the chance to talk to you. Looking forward to it.
I definitely want to talk about your book, and I want to talk about being a joiner because I know that's something near and dear to your heart. And I think, though, it's best for us to start with a little bit of background information. And let me preface that and not trying to be humorous here, but every now and then I have a flashback to when we first conceived of this podcast, Drowning in the Tech Talent Pool, the intersection of talent and technology. And I remember when we were trying to come up with, hey, how should this look? How should this come across? And I just remember saying, I want jaunty music on the intro and the outro. And I envisioned my head on, the body of Charlton Heston parting the Red Sea, or my face on Triton ordering the oceans around, the red ocean and the blue ocean, and that whole concept of marketing with my trident. Fortunately, there are some very sane and level-headed people I work with who put the stop to my maniacal plan for everything except the jaunty music. And along the way, it got me to thinking about the whole startup world and the ecosystem where, there's technology and complex problems, but there's also this great opportunity to have a lot of fun, not just solving problems, but building stuff and being creative and being innovative. And I was hoping, Sarah, that maybe you could share a little bit of your background as we go forward about what brought you to where you are today, so that folks can hear it and get some context about, I think, some of the cool stuff we've got to talk about today.
Sure. Well, thank you, John. I share your enthusiasm for the startup world. I think, after, more than a decade in this industry, we've seen it continue to change and evolve, but what doesn't change and evolve is the opportunity to learn, opportunity to grow, and to do it with really great people alongside you. So that's been my primary motivator, I think, throughout my career, is finding startup opportunities that really push me to grow, and where I get to do that growth alongside people whom I admire and really value those relationships along the way. So just a bit about me, and then maybe happy to answer questions or talk maybe more interactively about the book. But I, as you mentioned, I'm a B2B SaaS marketing executive, and found the B2B world, the SaaS world, to be thrilling, exciting, really challenging in a good way. And along my journey growing my own career, I stumbled upon this real gap in the startup ecosystem, which was support for people like me, joiners who were not necessarily the founders of startups, not necessarily the people who were building the companies from day one, but were joining these companies and providing tremendous impact. And I felt like there were all these books and resources out there for venture capitalists, so investors, but also for founders, and very little out there for people like me. So I took it upon myself to research and write a couple of books, the most recently being Lead Upwards, which is focused on helping startup employees break into leadership and how to also be successful going from an individual contributor or a manager or director to a VP or C-level at a startup, and what is required from a board expectations level, executive leadership level, but also from a personal growth perspective. So it's been a great journey, really unexpected. I love the marketing side too, but I think the people side has what's motivated me. And so having this through line of how do we empower, how do we bring everyone along with us on this journey, not just the founders and the investors, it's been very gratifying.
Yeah, well, I think it's impactful too, because to your point, there's this underserved segment of talent out there who may or may not think, wow, I want to join a startup or I want to join an early stage company. And I think, and of course, you and I connected through Gus Besselo and talking about kind of the financial side of that, the number side of it. But your approach on the people side, I think, is very relevant, because if you're going to go get into a startup or an early stage company, in a perfect world, that company's going to grow. What are you, as that candidate or that employee, going to do? You're going to have to grow. You're going to have to keep up, or you become a drag on it. And I kind of like that. Personally, I kind of like that opportunity to put down my own footprint and kind of grow or die, if that makes sense. I know that doesn't sound really attractive, like, hey, I want to go here because I'm either going to get really good at this or I'm going to get booted out. But in a sense, that's kind of the urgency that is at everyone's heels, especially if they have VC money or seed money and they're trying to build something in a hurry.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're getting at something which folks have talked about a lot, especially with, I think, the climate up until really last year, funding where companies were forced to scale, or I'd say had the opportunity to scale very quickly, especially VC funded venture-backed companies. And so there was this gap between sort of, you very quickly need people with certain skills and the background to perform at certain level. And then you didn't really have enough time to train up the more junior folks to take on those roles. That being said, I'm noticing a trend. I'd be curious to hear your feedback, where companies now are being a little bit more cautious about hiring in terms of velocity, and not that hiring has frozen. I think that's sped up again. Funding has come back in some ways, but there's, from my experience, even more opportunities for startup joiners to go from certain level to the next level internally. And so those internal promotions, I think, are a really impactful way for companies to recognize and value the talent they already have. And so giving them my book, sharing them with them this podcast, coaching, different peer-based support groups. These are all ways that as startup contributors, we can really take our careers to the next level, sometimes even at the same company that we're at, although we can talk about it. But there are certain cases where I think you do have to leave in order to level up.
Well, you may have to leave because you outpace the company, right? And I don't know in the book if you address cultural differences. And by culture, I'm a simpleton. It's nothing fancy. I think culture is how we go about our business, right? You wouldn't go to a large insurance company and take an actuarial and place them into my hair's on fire, flying by the seat of my pants startup where I have to wear 20 hats in a day. And it may not be the 2 or 3 hats switching. It may be, 10 or 12 or 20 completely different hats in terms of functionality. I mean, that's a tough environment. And you know what? Not everyone's built for it. And that's one thing I would say probably needs to be a thread that weaves through everything, is that, man, does a culture in this place, is it how they go about their business? How does it align with how I like to do things, how I'm comfortable with doing it? Otherwise, and I think there's no place where it's more amplified than startup and early stage, where we're burning energy being focused on fitting in or being a people pleaser, and not burning energy on execution. There's no place where it more amplifies the difference of that, which is success or failure, frankly, I think, than that context. And it's not for everybody, but there are people who outgrow and outshine. I just had an exchange with someone this morning, as a matter of fact, who was talking about there are a lot fewer candidates interested in going to early stage companies or startups. And because, the funding wasn't abundant, maybe times are harder or whatever. And I related immediately to my industry as a headhunter. And that when the market's really good, everybody kind of swarms. They all flood into it. I'm a recruiter now. And they make some money and they do well, and that's fine and dandy. And usually the next cycle, when it tapers off and maybe the bottom drops out in some cases, they evaporate. They swarm back out. I guess, reverse swarm. Is that even a term? I don't know. But they go back out into other sectors and other spaces, which the people who have been through the ups and downs like me, we're kind of like, yeah, don't worry, because by the time the market goes back up, it'll be a happy hunting grounds for us, because there won't be anybody out there to compete with, like there was going into 23, and now through all the layoffs and everything, it's it's thinned the herd quite a bit. But I think this is a fantastic time to attract talent that wants to be there, that wants to be in that context. And they'll ride it through the ups and downs because it fits them well. But because right now you have a chance to focus on that and from a talent acquisition standpoint and really stack the deck in your favor. I don't know how you see it, Sarah, but that's how I see it is, I want the people who want to be in who aren't just coming in because the bandwagon is moving in a favorable direction.
So you said a lot there. I think the piece of what you just said that really resonates with me is this concept that I talk about in the book called attunement, which is the point. Being in a startup is really about alignment. And something that I found happens naturally at companies is we all align to the founders. And so I use examples in the book, but for instance, I worked at a company where it was not allowed to expense alcohol because the founder didn't drink. And so it was just sort of known we don't, alcohol is not an expense. So with a client or out, that was the culture. That hasn't been the case at most other startups I've worked for. And I just, even to give the other side of it, I worked for a startup where the founder always made sure, I'd say the company always made sure there were IPAs at company events. I was like, where did this IPA thing come from? And it turned out the founder really liked IPAs. And it's like things, you have to really trace them back. Okay, no alcohol, only drinking IPAs. There were other beverages too. But I think my point is it can be sort of arbitrary. And the laws of physics at startups, literally, is the sky blue here, can be really different from company to company and to some degree from team to team. Your point about self-awareness. Okay, am I coming, am I an auditor? Or, I think about tax season, right? Like the interactions I have with my CPA firm are very different than I have with a branding agency. And, just coming off of, updating a brand and redoing the website and moving really quickly and then taxes, right? Like it's a different skill set. Engineers, the legal teams, there's stereotypes here, but I think there's also a way in which at early stage startups, I think it cuts across all functions. I was having dinner last night actually with some friends who are engineers, a couple, and one of them was saying he had moved to an early stage startup and was like, Sarah, is this normal? We hired these people, they don't have the skills and I'm managing them and they're in this other country and what's happening. It was a lot of chaos. And I said, well, parts of that maybe, but also you have to figure out if it works for you. And I think he had come from a very large enterprise. And so wherever you're coming from, if you're joining a company, you need to learn what's that company really like? How are their financials? Are they going to be around in a year? And maybe to your point about, I have curiosity about your experience with talent and potential risk aversion right now, because I do think, actually, I'm seeing the opposite. I'd be curious to get your feedback of people actually really being wary of larger companies right now because of the layoffs, because of ways in which entire teams have, been deprioritized versus smaller companies. There's, maybe I'm seeing that shift, but I'd be curious what you're seeing in the market.
I think the herd has been fractured. That's a good way to put it. You can see where certain things are going different ways. People are always going to want to get into the startup scene, I think. And especially if it's something that connects with them or is promising. The challenge, to your point, is in tech, especially, there's been a lot of large company layoffs. But look, I'm from Texas. I reside here. I'm kind of in the belly button of the country in a sense, sort of, I guess. There's less polite things I could say, but belly button works fine. And I kind of sit back and I've seen these large companies over decades, growing up in the oil patch. That's where, my dad worked back in the 70s and 80s. I saw the glut. I saw the collapse. The big companies that made it through, guess what? The people who were staying in that industry, guess where they ended up? They either went back to those big companies, or some enterprising person or set of people, some group of engineers, some group of whoever's who were laid off said, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to start our own thing. And they would build, a certain percentage of them successfully build companies and hire a lot of people. But if you were in that industry, you rode through the ups and downs, and the players were the players. And that may evolve over time, and they do, but the players are the players. Same's true in tech. And my perspective has always been that when you have large layoffs, I expect a big spate of entrepreneurialism, of startups. Now, in this case, around tech and just startups in general, I think there's been less funding available because when the COVID lockdowns were happening, people were just standing on the street corner trying to put money into investment, into anything that was B2C especially, and made life easier, like subscription toilet paper deliveries. There were the TP wars at Costco are legendary. When the call first went out, well, I imagine that'd be a great thing if you could actually have delivered, a subscription of TP when people were locked down. You would have had a really great business until they became unlocked down, and then things change. And I think there's a lot of money still locked up that hasn't come back to the VCs and investment bankers and such to be able to reinvest into the ecosystem. And so I think, yes, there are candidates who want in, but there's not always healthy homes for them to go to, if that makes sense. And I think that's why your book especially is one of those things I think people can turn to kind of roadmap out, hey, where are the ditches that I need to stay out of? Where are the speed bumps? Where are the potholes? Where are the things that could derail my career? Because I think it's important. A decade or two ago, if you moved around and had 3 jobs in 4 years, it was like you had a pox or something. No one wanted to talk to you as a candidate. But that's changed in part because the startup ecosystem, that environment has become so much prolific, has such a higher level of visibility that companies now are like, oh, 3 jobs in 4 years. But what did you do during those 3 jobs? And they want to know more because you can't overlook people who are talented and who've made moves. For instance, what you touched on earlier, because they've outpaced the growth of their current company.
Yeah, it's interesting framing, outpacing the growth. I also think companies can really rapidly change depending on ownership. And something I've seen, is I've been through 6 startup acquisitions now, some better than others, but a couple of real home runs, which has been really gratifying and exciting, but also just seeing how a startup can really change its trajectory. I think it's important for candidates. I write about this in my book. I appreciate you bringing it back to this. And, my mind's a little distracted with sort of toilet paper deliveries and, and I'm not a B2C sort of native. I come from the B2B world. I think we can learn a lot from B2C, but that's a separate topic. I think where my head's right now is, for candidates who are in a company and it's like, have we outgrown each other, or is this still a fit? And I really encourage people to think about their own goals, because something I've actually found at startups, which is it's quite challenging. It's something I think really sneaks up on you. And I'll share what it is and I'll offer a couple of strategies to overcome it, which is often if you're a high performer, you can be really good at something, absolutely hate it, or potentially like it enough, but not enough to keep going in it. And so I'll give an example.
Right.
Early in my career, I write about this in the book. I was in a client-facing role and I was really good at it. Empathetic person, was able to fly around the world, meet with customers, enterprise clients, and voice the customer work, customer marketing. I really enjoyed it up until I really didn't. And I started to look around my family and I was like, I'm on a plane a lot and I'm an introvert. My clients are great. I think as a marketer, really anyone at a tech company benefits from actually meeting with the people who are using your product or service. So I'm a huge fan of meeting with customers, don't get me wrong, but being in that degree of frequency and intensity of client-facing work was really not for me. But I kept getting promoted because I was so good at it. And it's a weird problem to have, but I often see this with high performers where if you're really good at one thing or a couple of things, you can get siloed and become a specialist in that area. So you have to really be thoughtful and say, do I want to be a specialist in this area? Leadership requires a level of being a generalist that we don't, I think, talk about enough, especially if you're coming up. I'll give an example because I'm in marketing, but if you're wanting to be a team leader, it's not just about you knowing how to do your specific thing. It's about being able to manage the outputs and productivity of your team and people who are doing things that they might be better at you at that specific thing, but you need to know enough to know how to manage. I quote a former CEO I worked with who had a background as a CFO. And when he first became a CFO, he's like, I didn't know how to do a lot of the things I was hiring my team to do. Like I had to learn how to manage people who are running payroll and doing all these things that weren't in his background.
Right.
Finance guy. So my point is, I think you have to really think, is this what I want? There's nothing wrong with being a specialist or being in a certain IC track. But if you want to be a leader in a leadership role and have a greater span of influence and sort of manage others' productivity, you have to think differently. And so again, if you're in a company where maybe there's already a CFO or a VP of finance or a director of finance, and
Mhm.
you're going to do that work, you might have to leave in order to maybe get access to it. Not always, but I think that's something important for folks to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that goes back, it echoes the outpacing the growth of the company. You can outpace the growth of the organizational structure, the org chart of your company. And I think it's one of those things where you're doing really great. You could be the next controller, the next CFO. You're ready to go, but the other person's not. So what do? Well, you can either go to a different function or you can just go to a different company, which, look, I'm a headhunter. I love that. So I don't have a problem with it. But it can be harmful too, because companies and founders, I think especially, you get attached to ideas. You put your heart and your soul into it. You bring someone in, you nurture them, you help them grow, and they're killing it. They're blowing it up, and they decide to leave you. Talk about a shot to your ego. It's almost like, hey, I had this great innovation, this great idea. And I wrote it on the erasable Post-it note in my shower, because that's when all great ideas percolates, right? Right when you're sleeping or when you're in a shower. And somebody, came in and stole it from me or whatever it was, or they took it away from me. The house cleaner took it, and now they're living in Beverly Hills in a $10 million mansion because they found, the secret to whatever that was in my shower notepad thing that I'm just imagining and making up as I'm going along. But the idea being, as a founder or an executive that trains and builds people, that can be a real shot across the bow when someone walks away, not because they're outpacing the organization, but they've outpaced the organizational structure and functionality.
Well,
to me, that's a little scary too, because in the final equation, as a founder or as an executive or as a leader of people, you have to be willing to pat that person on the back and say, hey, great job. Doors open. Come back at some point if timing allows. You got to have a humble attitude about it, an attitude that's looking out for the best of others. And I don't know that everybody necessarily does. I mean, it's a tough business growing something from nothing.
One of the reasons I enjoy this ability to talk to you in this free flowing way, John, is you're capturing my attention with. I'm really curious what ideas you've come up with in the shower. Now I will just give a shout out to my brother, who's an entrepreneur, and he keeps this like notepad in the shower, and it's kind of famous. And seeing the notes after,
It's kind of
he shared that with me. But I think, look, I was privileged enough to do an interview with a man who's well known in the marketing world, the SaaS world, named Jeffrey Moore. He wrote this book called Crossing the Chasm. And I've done a couple of interviews with him. And one thing he said to me that really struck out is, people, whether it's customers or employees, this is not a prisoner relationship, right? This has to be mutually beneficial for customers too, which I think his point was about customer success and ensuring ongoing value, which really aligns with the SaaS model. But I think there's a sense too of the employer-employee relationship has shifted in the last few years. I've seen this where this idea of the employer is, going to always take care of you or be this. I mean, that's a fantasy we've seen just play out with companies potentially hiring for areas they no longer need or needing to become more efficient, having to streamline operations. We've all seen this in the news and gone through that, having to make hard decisions at our companies in order to move the business forward. So there's that kind of, people's departure, but there's also the departure that I think would be unwanted attrition, where people are potentially contributing value. And to their point, it can feel personal when we're working with people. But at the same time, to your point, I think wouldn't we want people to feel like they're there because they really have so many options and they're choosing to stay, not because of this fear? And I've worked at companies and left and come back. I've personally seen that. I think maintaining relationships is important on both sides. I'd also say I have a chapter in my book about how to leave a company with, I would say, some sense of, I almost want to say dignity, but really, I'd say leaving a company the way that you'd be proud of. And there's all kinds of circumstances. And I would also say companies don't always depart people with the most grace. And that's something that I think should shift. But
grace is a great word, by the way.
Thank you. I think, so I wrote in the book, I remember the first time I left an exec role, I had another job offer and I gave 4 months notice, 3 months notice, 3.5. It was a lot of time for me. I was used to this idea of you leave a job and you give a few weeks. I mean, this is very American, but in other cultures, that's not the case. You have probation, but then you also have notice periods. It really depends on where the laws require. And so while, in the US in tech, we have at will, I think leaving a role as an executive with 2 weeks notice it feels
a little tight.
It's irresponsible. I don't know how to do it. I wouldn't personally, I've never done that. I would never know how to hand off a department with 2 weeks. That just seems incredibly difficult. And if I were to have skin in the game, if any of us have skin in the game and have some equity, think about the value of your equity, at least, of wanting to make sure you're doing the most you can to leave the company in a great place. And so I also think there's cases where founders, to your point, they get frustrated and tell people to close their laptops and say, take a hike. That can happen. People need to prepare for it.
Right.
Be prepared if you're giving notice that someone might not want you to stay for that month or 2 months that you think. And there's real ramifications, health insurance. But if you have a good relationship with your manager or your CEO or co-founder, I think in many cases, a pleasant departure is possible. So I'm trying to also help people think about, how you want to be treated, because the way you treat the company will be remembered.
In the final equation, everybody grows up hearing about this, but it's true. Treat others the way you want to be treated. If you want dignity and respect and you want grace extended to you for your faux pas and your foibles, well, then demonstrate dignity and respect and grace towards other people. And I remember the very first time after college when I had to terminate someone. And frankly, I didn't want to terminate. I was a nice guy. I didn't want to have to do it. But he just kept making these repetitive errors. They were impacting a lot of people. And he wasn't moving past it, so I had to. And of course, you take someone with you when you do that. And I didn't have an HR person. I mean, I was the controller of this group, but we didn't have HR in that at the field level at that juncture. And I just remember the gentleman I took with me probably had 35 more years of career experience. I mean, way up the food chain in that respect. And he said that was probably the most gracious firing is what he said I've ever heard. Because nothing against the guy. And I think whether you're resigning or you're being resigned, as the case may be, taking it in a way that you save the emotional piece for later and consider, hey, how would this impact me if I'm on the other side of this table? I think it's important. I think it's really critical because, look, and I think I shared some of this with you in a prior conversation. I've been through, 5 years of cancer when my first wife was terminal. Went through several other procedures, health issues with her. Been through it with, parents. None of my parents, none of my grandparents are living anymore. I've remarried, and the woman I remarried also is a cancer widow. And so we have this commonality that kind of helps bind us together. But part of that is we have a sense of how we want to be treated as a grieving person, as a widow or a widower, as a caregiver, and a whole host of other areas, because we've had time to think about it and put ourselves in someone else's shoes, because in a large part, we've been in those shoes. And I remember being so nervous talking to someone in years past who was dealing with something that was traumatic in life, like that loss and caregiving for someone who's gonna, his time is short. And it was a real eye opener to wear those shoes, to walk in those shoes. And I approach people like that completely differently now. I remember a lady at church lost her husband, and I just went and I sat down beside her one day on a pew, just kind of shoulder to shoulder. I looked at her, she looked at me, and we just kind of sighed, and we had that moment of connection where I get it. I understand to some degree you being where you are. And I think if we take those lessons forward that maybe we learn later in life, hopefully you don't learn them early. I hope you learn them later the hard way if you're going to learn it that way, but that we take those forward and consider that before we have that very difficult conversation, it can impact someone's career or impact the business that employs other people, for example. You know, in case the vehicle for carrying someone's hopes and dreams forward, because that innovator, that founder, who can be a real chucklehead, real knucklehead about things, difficult, hard-nosed, that is because that person sees this vehicle for their hopes and dreams. And you can be really hard-nosed and difficult about your own career, and that's fine too, but see where they're coming from. And maybe you give them a chance to understand where you come from as well. And I'm sorry to be touchy-feely and all this other stuff. I mean, I'm from Texas. We're not supposed to be that way, you know. But I think no matter what complex technical issues we deal with, Sarah, ultimately business for the most part is still people buying from people doing business with people making a connection. So I know it is in the headhunting world. You've got to make connections with people and resonate with them. And that's one of the reasons why I appreciate your book and the effort you went through, is because I feel like, and if you had told me, well, I'm an introvert in the marketing world, I would have went, whatever. That's not true. But if you step back and think about it for a second, that's what I've been doing as we've been talking. Your book really feels like not just an attempt to close that gap you're talking about, but a real extension of empathy for people who are following in similar paths that you've walked on.
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you for sharing your truth, and that story is really touching. I think listeners hopefully can all resonate with some area of difficulty in their lives where someone who was able to reach out really meant something. And I also think, to your point, I have a lot of empathy for startup founders and for board members, for VCs. I think there's a shared goal of everyone wants this thing to succeed. And I know that, on our best days as managers, as leaders, we're going to get it wrong. We're going to make mistakes. And I really like this concept in psychology of repair, this idea of, we're not always going to be perfect, but we're going to really try to make it right and make it better. And so this book is my little attempt at some repair, both for things I wish I'd had in my past self. I have a chapter on navigating failure and challenge. We've kind of lionized it in the startup world for founders. Like, okay, you had a failure and then the success comes and we can celebrate that. But I think especially for members of underrepresented groups, for women, for minorities, for folks people with disabilities, or maybe have a spouse with a chronic illness, or who are, in a situation where, they don't necessarily feel like they're part of a dominant group, whatever that looks like in tech. It can be even more pressure to be perfect, or to feel like we need to outperform and be 100%, 110% every day. Whereas, every single person, no matter their background, is going through something. So I think what you've said is really hit the nail on the head, which is there's no one who feels like they perfectly are getting it right, like they belong. We wouldn't be in the startup world if we had all the answers. We'd be at maybe a larger company and much less disruptive. The whole idea of disrupting is you're trying to figure something out. So I think that element of empathy in the book is also for everyone. It's not just for employees. And I think also figuring out, as an employee, how do you have empathy if you're bored? What do they care about?
That's actually really interesting. How do you have empathy if you're bored? Oh my. Empathy, I think, at least at conception of empathy, requires effort, because you got to think about what it's like to be in someone else's context and scenario. And it can become automatic in that sort of a setting, but maybe for A, but not for B, because you haven't done that with B. So you got to work through that with B. And okay, if I see B, then I have this level of compassion driven by empathy, or whatever it might be. But when you're bored and your mind is not occupied. There's an old adage, an old saying that, what is it? An idle mind is devil's workshop. And pull it out from, take it out of the religious context for a moment. But when people are bored nowadays, what do? They're looking at screens. They're watching 7-second videos or 14-second videos or 140 character or whatever's. And is that really productive? Is that really creative? Is that really moving the needle in your life forward? Or is that just mindless vegetating?
I really appreciate it. I actually meant empathy of your board members. And I love that you heard.
Oh, there's that too.
If you're bored. No, but I think both work. But I actually think, well, what you're saying actually is another side to it, which is if you're disengaged, it kills it, right? It's really hard, I think, to be. Actually, I think there's a side to this we don't talk about enough, which is if you don't feel seen at work by someone, or if you don't feel like you belong, especially as members of underrepresented groups, but really anyone, if your manager doesn't take the time to know who you are on some level as a person, we all have a lot to get done. Like, who is John? What is John going through in his life? What's behind all of the different pieces that I see as his manager that, going through the work? I think that shuts off people's productivity. So that, I think, what's the antidote to boredom or is really that connection. And I have found I do my best work when I feel connected to my executive team, when I feel connected to my leadership team, to my board, to my CEO, my co-founders, and to my team. And I think we also need to be very humble at that place of every single person's going through something.
I think it's fantastic points. I'm sorry I misheard. I heard bored and I immediately thought BORED.
Both.
Rather than BOARD. And you know what, though? It's pretty impactful in both directions, to your point, because, I remember early in my career, one of the things that annoyed me was working 6 days a week in a salaried position, busting my tail, not knowing any better, working so hard, and getting offered a 3% raise. And going out in the market, and 3 or 4 weeks later, I got myself a 25% raise, plus a sign bonus, plus stock options, plus an annual bonus. And 7 months later, after I started the new role, got another promotion within that company. But I remember going back years later and talking to my very first boss after college. And he said, after you left, I cussed your name for about 30 days. He said, and then he paused and he goes, then I realized what I had done to you. He ended up replacing me with 3 people. He had 3 people come in and do the job I was doing. And had he given me a 10% raise and patted me on the back and said, man, you're doing a good job, I would have kept busting my tail doing the work of 3 people. Somebody at a higher level, someone at my level, and somebody at a clerical level. That's what it took for the workload that had been dropped on my desk. And he was trying to figure out for a month, why is he taking this shortcut? Why is he taking that shortcut? And then he realized, oh, crud, I put him in an untenable position. And I think he realized because he wasn't engaged and I wasn't seeing the impact through compensation being awarded or opportunities being awarded to me of the work I was doing, then that put the end to that relationship in terms of working. So I agree with you. I think it's not just being seen as an individual, but it's also knowing that what you're doing, believing in your heart, is having an impact. It matters. And it's even better if it matters to someone you really respect. And I think that really drives productivity.
Such a powerful story. Well, good for you for figuring out your worth in the market, and also good for your former manager for having some self-awareness. And that's, very honest to tell you his reaction. And
it's not that I didn't expect honesty from him, because the guy, he was unvarnished. He'd tell you what he thinks. And I always like that. But yeah, I was surprised.
Yeah.
The way he phrased it, I realized what I'd done to you. And I'm like, wow. And I was just, 22 years old and dumb.
I think there's another point here to pull out. And I wrote about this in my book, which is often I think on the startup journey, we think, so there's the other side to it, which is, yes, absolutely go chase a title, go chase more money, make sure you're getting compensated for the value you're provided. This is business. We're not here for our health. But I think there's a piece where a lot of startup employees, to feel recognized, think they want that promotion or some specific, set of advancements, that really eventually they want recognition and they want to be doing the work that matters. So I'll give an example that I share in the book, which is I had an employee who was in a generalist role, kind of doing everything in marketing, but he got very interested in brand and PR. And he started asking me, Sarah, can I take on some additional projects? And through our career work conversations and our one-on-ones where we dedicated time, which I always do with my team to really understand what they want to grow in, not just what I think and what the business thinks, and trying to find alignment there. Not always possible. And again, having those hard conversations like, yeah, we don't really have a need for this at this business. What does that mean? How do we navigate that? But really hearing what they think. It's not just, I want this next title. It's, I want to be doing this work. And so sometimes that surprises me. I remember a young woman I managed a while ago, and I had assumed she had wanted to get to director title in this particular part of marketing. And so we'd had a conversation about it. And it turns out that wasn't her goal at all. She wanted to switch to being an entrepreneur. Like her goal was to run her own creative agency at one point, which blew my mind. She was not
good on her.
She was not doing that work. And so she said, Sarah, what I really want is to manage all the freelancers who are in this department. You've given them to this guy to manage, but I want to learn how to manage them because one day I'd like my own business. And I thought, I never would have known that. And it didn't impact the work. She was still delivering outcomes. We were able to give her a little bit more of the work that she was excited about. And I think of that example because my ideas as a manager can really limit someone. And I don't ever want to do that. I mean, if your former boss, if they had known where you'd be now, John, right? Like, you're running your own business. You're creating success for, all of these companies, and you're changing lives with these placements. I think we can have our own small ideas of where people are going, and it's important not to let that impact.
Limit them.
Yeah.
Well, I had a conversation with a fellow just today, going into an interview, and he asked, "Are we going to talk about money in the interview?" And I said, "No, I shouldn't." And in fact, if it comes up, I always defer negotiations to me. And I said, because I don't want you focused on money right now. Yes, it's important. Yes, we're going to deal with it. But I want you focused on the value of you in this opportunity. What's the value to you? Forget money for a second. Where does this help you go in 2 years and 5 years and whatever the number is? As a hiring manager, an executive, a founder, we really need to give thought to something that we can't necessarily quantify with dollars. What is the value I'm giving to that person? So when I used to do a lot of recruiter training and development, hiring them for some larger companies, my personal philosophy was always that by the time we get through the training and onboarding and get you up to speed, I'm not going to want you to leave. But if this person chooses to leave, I want to make sure you got a skill set that you can take to anyone in the industry and succeed, or go carve out your own little niche somewhere, your own shingle hanging out. Because I believe there's tremendous value in teaching a person to do that, because you've given them tools with which they can make a living, that they can have options. And it's the same thing I tell my kids, you need options. That means you need to learn skills. You may not like to learn customer service in restaurants. So what? Go learn it. Go figure out that sometimes you got to take the road of, I'm so sorry, sir or ma'am, it's my fault. Let me make it right. And not get upset about it. And that's a hard lesson for young people. It's a hard lesson for some of us, not so young people. Learning those skills and building on them. It's tough. Sarah, I've got to ask something before we run out of time.
Sure.
Two things, actually. Number one, your book, Lead Upward. If somebody wants it, I'm assuming they can find you on Amazon. And as an ebook, as an audiobook, as hard copy. Thank you for developing that, because I think to do that and to have the awareness to address a gap like that and share so much of yourself in it and lessons learned, that's not an easy task. I think that's something you've got to be passionate about. You got to almost feel a calling for. So that leads me to my second statement / question, or whatever I'm mal-using the English language. What is it out there that is next for you after Lead Upward? What is the passion project or the flame that's lit for you going forward, and where's that going to take you?
I'm working on a new book. Thank you for asking. I think seem to be addicted, and maybe in a good way. I don't. I have friends who are also authors. I think there's something very gratifying about what I really like about books. And I'll put this out there for anyone who's interested in writing a business book, who's listening to this. Find me on LinkedIn. My name's Sarah E. Brown. There's a lot of Sarah Browns. If you add the E, it's a little easier. But you can also go to my website, sarahbrownmarketing.com. And I always love hearing from people who want to write books, because I think we need more truth out in the world, and your individual truth is only yours to share. I interviewed 50 people, almost 50 people for my last book, Lead Upwards. And I'm currently in the middle of interviewing a lot of entrepreneurs, VCs, startup employees for this new project. So I'm not quite ready to share what it's about, but it's a bit of an extension of Lead Upwards, maybe focused a little bit more on the international startup game. So really understanding what opportunities are available for remote global hybrid in this current economy for startup employees. So more on that. It's very early stages, but I think that plus being able to talk to people like you, I'm a marketer. I love what I do, but having these conversations really motivates me. It reminds me of why I do this work. So what's next, I think, is in those lines, along those lines, and then possibly more books to come. We'll see.
Well, when that book gets ready, you'll have to let me know. We'll have to talk again, because there's no shame in self-promoting or having someone else bring it up out there, because I think it's fantastic. And I think it fills a need in the market that some people are, see, and some people are like, wow, this really is something I needed to find out about. So thank you for that, Sarah. And thank you very much for joining us on Drowning in the Tech Talent Pool.
My pleasure. Thanks, John.
You've been listening to Drowning in the Tech Talent Pool. This podcast is sponsored by Sabertooth. Sabertooth improves the quality of hire and speeds up the time to fill specialized machine learning, data engineering, data science, and developer roles, stretching tech recruiting budgets further by bringing the precision of retained search and the speed of contingent search to the market in one complete solution. Find out more at sbr2th.com and follow me, John Light, on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening.